times. And it's always a good time to have him come around budget, and he can give us, what can I say for the economy, or not?
I didn't bring any good news.
Okay, well, so I'm just gonna turn it over to Sam, and we got a lot of people online, so it's great.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to do what I kind of always do for you and just give you a general overview of what's going on in the economy. I try to assume when I give these presentations that this is the only time that you will listen to an economist yammer for some extended period of time in a given year. So therefore, we should try to cover all the topics. So today we're going to be talking labor supply and also demographics. So we're going to try to hit spectrum of topics right now. And what you're going to kind of sense as we move through these topics is that the overarching narrative of the American economy right now is that there are some severe physical economy. And the key word is on that word physical, right? We're not used to a world where there are really physical constraints in America. We're used to thinking in terms of financial constraints. If we can afford something, we can procure it, right? Finance tends to be the defining frontier of our abilities in this country. Right now, we're facing physical limitations, and you're going to sense this theme popping up again and again as we move through these topics. So I'm going to start off with the inflation portion, then we'll move to labor supply and demographics, which are really kind of the same topic. But I would like to begin by kind of addressing some rumors that you may have heard about inflation. These rumors are true. We do have very severe inflation right now. So this is the year-over-year growth in what we call the consumer price index. And the consumer price index is kind of our standard measurement of inflation. Now, two things to note about the consumer price index. It's not a cost of living index, okay, because it's national averages, and it is also not really designed to reflect how money is allocated in a household budget, right? It's just looking at average prices. The second thing to note is that it's not a measure of the dollar, okay? So this is not looking at exchange rates or the price of gold or anything like that. It's just how we evaluate what's going on with prices. And in the most recent month that we had, March data showed 8.5% year-over-year inflation. Okay, so this is the fastest price growth that we have had since the 1970s. Okay, and we need to think back to what the economic environment was like in the 1970s. In the 1970s, it went into the high teens. It went in excess of 16%. And the way the Federal Reserve dealt with this, the monetary policy tool, was to raise interest rates. Okay. We've become accustomed to interest rates of essentially 0% for the last decade. The 1970s benchmark mortgage rates were approaching 20% as the way that they tried to control inflation. So we're already getting rate hikes. We anticipate something like 7 or 8 interest rate increases this year and potentially more next year. So the benchmark mortgage rate just hit 5%, which sounds really high to us. But remember, contextually, that's still very low compared to what we had the last time inflation got this high. Okay, so inflation is high and interest rates are going to be very high very soon relative to what we're used to. Now, the thing to note is that this March number was the first month where we had data collected after the Russia-Ukraine war started. Okay, so in February, inflation was 8%, and February's data was all from before the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. So we're just starting to see the impacts of that. It remains to be seen how high that will drive inflation. So the obvious question to ask, why do we have inflation? Why is always a good question to ask. So we're going to see how much kind of explanatory mileage we can get out of this old idea that we call supply and demand, right? It's not very hot with academic economists because it's not that sophisticated, right? So they like to use really sophisticated monetary policy models that make them feel better about it. We don't want to use a theory that everyone can understand, because then we aren't necessarily the smartest people in the room. But it turns out supply and demand is explaining inflation, and you don't really need much of a more complicated model to understand why we have inflation. So let's talk about the macro economy. That's just our term for the whole national $25 trillion thing that is the US economy. What happened on the demand side? Well, what is demand when we're talking about the whole country? Demand is just money. It's the amount of money that is available attempting to be spent on goods and services. And massive expansion of demand during the pandemic, coming from a couple of different sources. So we had stimulus payments, right? But it wasn't just the direct cash deposits. It was also expanded unemployment insurance. It was things like waiving rent payments, deferring rents, deferring student loans. These are all a form of stimulus because they're freeing up cash for other purposes for households. Right? And the stimulus payments were kind of funny because it was this real life example of something that economists have always kind of discussed in a tongue-in-cheek way. We always had this concept that we called helicopter money. It was mostly a joke. The idea was if the economy is really stuck, you print cash and throw it out of a helicopter, and people will pick it up and spend it, and then the economy is healed, right? They actually did it, right? So it turns out you have to be careful because people can't always tell if something's a sarcastic proposal. That's what stimulus checks were, essentially. We lost the sort of cinematic flair that would come from throwing Benjamins out of a helicopter, but from an economic perspective, that's what it was. It was just direct cash disbursement. So this was a new type of kind of novel experiment in American economic policy, and it created a massive increase in demand, in consumption capability. We also had another green arrow. There we go. Government spending is higher, right? And because we're going to maintain political neutrality here, we're not talking spent well simply from an accounting purpose. Government spending is more demand, okay? And government spending has been rising year over year. Deficits continue to grow, okay? So that's more demand. And then we have what we call pent-up demand. And this refers to the fact that during the pandemic, people were saving. Because there was a lot of economic uncertainty. So really apart from those Costco runs for water and toilet paper, which I never understood, because if the municipal infrastructure breaks down, like a pallet of Aquafina is probably not like a long-term survival strategy. But anyway, apart from bottled water and toilet paper, spending went way down in 2020 during the heart of the pandemic. Okay, so not only do you have more money going into people's pockets, unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, et cetera, you also have people spending far less. So there's this great irony. Q2 and Q3 of 2020, unemployment is 15% plus. It feels like the economy is grinding to a halt. And yet, those were the 2 quarters where American households had more liquidity than ever before. So it's an all-time high for spending power. At the same time, the economy is frozen. Very weird. Normally, unemployment and income are, negatively correlated. That kind of makes sense, right? This time around, it was the opposite. Okay, so what does all this add up to? $5 to $6 trillion more in liquidity in America right now than before the pandemic. Okay, that's demand. What's going on the supply side? Okay, we have shortages of raw materials and inputs. Lumber and gasoline are the ones that most consumers are most familiar with because we all have to gas up our cars. And we all remember when at a certain point, being able to build a planter box for your wife was this amazing flex of your social status, right? I can afford lumber. And it was like an upper class marker. Okay, so we all know that lumber and gas are super expensive, but it's not just those. It's also aluminum. It's a lot of very niche industrial inputs, manganese, palladium, chromium, fertilizer, wheat, and shipping costs, right? So there has been a severe crunch on the physical kind of sinews of the economy, the raw materials that underpin production of most products. Okay, now this is going to get worse due to the disruptions in Eastern Europe and also due to the kind of ripple effects of that. So let me give you a great example. You've all heard of the semiconductor shortage, right? Who's heard about this? Okay, so there's not enough semiconductors. This is a big problem because in 2022, an astonishing number of consumer products have computers in them, right? Your toaster is computerized to a certain extent. So it's not just major electronics. Most things are computerized, okay? You need semiconductors. Who knows how a semiconductor is made? Okay, you use a laser. You actually use a laser to etch the silicon wafer. And an industrial laser is made using processed neon gas. 70% of the world's processed neon gas is exported out of Odessa, Ukraine. Okay, so you might think processed neon gas doesn't sound like something super important, right? When you hear that the gas works in Ukraine are down, you know, what does that matter? But things are so complex. The modern economy is so complex. It has so many little nodes that can make the whole thing kind of fail. Okay, so you have a shortage of semiconductors anyway. Now you don't have enough neon to make the semiconductors. Well, what's the ripple effect of that? The ripple effect is that countries like China begin to hoard the semiconductor supply. Okay, so there's always these add-on effects of shortages that cause them to escalate. And so we are facing very serious raw material shortages globally right now. And these are expected to escalate as a result of the conflict in Eastern Europe, because you don't need Ukraine and Russia to be major exporters of all these finished products to have a really big impact on the economy, because everything's interconnected. They only need to be exporters of a few core key commodities to cause massive ripple effects. Great example, neon, fertilizer, wheat, and fossil fuels. These are things that come out of Russia and Ukraine. These are things that the global market is having a lot of trouble getting its hands on. Okay, secondly, we have a labor shortage. Now, this is a discrete topic that I'm going to be talking about kind of in some detail later, but suffice it to say there is a severe labor shortage, and having a labor shortage makes it very difficult to solve these other problems, because it means you don't have a reserve capacity to solve problems. We can make neon here. Neon is actually extracted from the atmosphere. You don't need any specific raw materials to get processed neon. It's very difficult to start up a massive neon processing facility when there's no excess labor in the country, right? So it's more difficult to solve other problems when you have a labor shortage underpinning, because that means you don't have kind of that surge production, a reservoir of productivity that you can tap into. Okay, we also have issues with transportation. So be honest, went sideways in the Suez Canal. How many of you had ever really thought about cargo container ships? Okay, you're cool, right? All right. Okay. Besides him, because he's cooler than the rest of us, we never think about cargo containers. It's just kind of something that we expect to function in the background. Okay, well, right now it's very difficult to get cargo containers and to get access to shipping. Our ports are severely backlogged right now. The wait times are extraordinary, weeks and weeks and weeks to offload ships. And this is tied into the labor shortage. Part of the reason there's a backlog is we don't have enough crane operators, we don't have enough longshoremen, and we don't have enough truck drivers to really get the ports moving efficiently. So recently I saw a statement from the director of the Port of Louisiana. You might think Port of Louisiana, is that a major shipping center? Well, that's where the Mississippi comes out, right? So that's kind of a shipping hub for most of the Midwest. Okay, he doesn't think his port will be fully cleared with normal wait times until late 2023. Because it's very difficult to solve these problems when you don't have labor. You need crane operators and truck drivers to make a port function efficiently, and there aren't enough of these skilled workers. Okay, so there is a little bit of good news. Apparently, the ports in Southern California are starting to clear their backlog, but that's because no ships are coming in from Shanghai. Because Shanghai is closed down, right? And once Shanghai opens up, it's going to be a big wave of ships trying to catch up on everything that's been bottled up in there, and who knows what will happen with the backlog, right? So global transportation is just a very fragile, interconnected system. Raw material needs to go from A to B for refining. Then it needs to go from B to C to be turned into components, C to D for final assembly, D to E to to get to the consumer, right? So products today tend to make an astonishing number of stops. Sometimes they'll crisscross the oceans multiple times, right? A raw material go from South America to Asia to North America. And so when COVID tried to make this stop on the dime, we learned this is not a system that can stop quickly, right? It piles up like a train, and then it takes a long time to get it functioning smoothly again. Okay, so this is our transportation problem. And then we just generally have global disruptions. And what we mean by this is really in the last 3 years or so, whole countries have shown a startling propensity to suddenly drop out of the economic system for an indeterminate amount of time. Before COVID, it was unthinkable that Shanghai, one of the busiest ports in the world, would just close for weeks, right? This is a new reality that we have to become accustomed to. Like I said, this is such a complex shipping system that one node going out can cause massive knock-on effects, right? If Malaysia decides they need to do a big old lockdown, Kuala Lumpur, how many of us ever think about the city of Kuala Lumpur? The Straits of Okay. I always get, a couple of hands, right? Most of us don't think about this. Kuala Lumpur, major shipping center. It's kind of on the highway from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. That shuts down, you get massive ripple effects. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with. So put this together, and what do we have? 6 trillion extra dollars trying to buy things at the same time that it's more difficult than ever to actually produce and deliver something to buy. So the basic reason that we have inflation is we have record high purchasing power at the same time that we have unprecedented supply chain problems, inability to deliver product. So this is a reverse of the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, America had plenty of productive capacity, idled factories, idled ports, right? The problem was no work was being done because there was no money, there was no liquidity in the system to actually purchase things, right? Now we have the opposite, way too much liquidity and limited productive capacity. This is the basic reason we have inflation. One good way we can look at this is we have something that we call the Predictor price index. So this is the red line. That blue line is the consumer index. So the way to think about this is a finished car goes in the CPI, the consumer index, aluminum, glass, rubber, computer chips, those go in the producer index, right? Look at the inflation being faced on the producer side. It's almost 25% year over year. Okay, so that is all your raw materials. That's your shipping costs. That's your energy costs on the production side. So the irony is that inflation seems really high, but so far we've actually been sheltered from the worst of it, because on the producer side, it's much, much worse. Okay, so this is the inflation story. And I personally do not think you need any kind of sophisticated model of monetary policy or a detailed theory of how the Federal Reserve operates to understand why we have inflation. I think you can get all this explanatory mileage you need out of supply and demand, which is probably why that's what they teach in like intro to microeconomics. You probably don't even need to take more economics courses after that, because we've already solved our problems with what we learned there. Okay, so I put up here a few key input prices just to kind of illustrate, give you some hard examples. So basically the way to read this is these dots on in the beginning, that's March of 2020, which is right before COVID. And then at the end, I'm showing you the current price. So in March of 2020, average shipping container rates, and this is averaged across different routes, right? Because there's different shipping routes, but if you take kind of the average, 1,400 for a 40-foot container, today it's over 8,000, okay? Aluminum, $1,600 a ton. Now it's up to 3,300, and then of course crude oil has nearly quadrupled. Okay, so these are just kind of 3 of the more important, kind of ubiquitous things that go into modern manufacturing and production. So when this is what's happening, this is kind of the bottom of the pyramid, right? If you think about how a product is made, at the very lowest level, you're just trading tonnage of aluminum and oil and things like that. And you can see that these prices have tripled, quadrupled, or about sixfold in the case of price of a shipping container. So it's no wonder everything's expensive. You go from the bottom up, from the raw materials up, and that's where you get your inflation. And again, I don't see the need for any more sophisticated, needlessly sophisticated economic thinking. Supply and demand gets us everything we need in terms of explaining this, right? And in economics, economists never have solutions. So if we can just explain why there's a problem, that's like a win for us, right? I don't know what to do about it, but it's like, oh, I can explain it. So it's like if your doctor just like stopped at diagnosing you. It's like, I don't know what to do, but you're welcome. Okay. So another way that we can see this is if we break the CPI down into different components. Okay, so we have services. Service is just anything that's not a tangible product. Healthcare, legal services, education, accounting, real estate services. Okay, so that's the red line. You'll notice the inflation isn't that bad for services. Why? Because services don't have big supply chains. There's not a lot of raw materials that go into it. It's intangible human element. So the inflation isn't as bad. Durable goods, on the other hand, is the blue line. Now, durable good, in the age of Chinese manufacturing, durable has nothing to do with how good the product is. Just means it's a product that you don't use up as soon as you buy it. So it's not food or gasoline, right? It's not something that you use up. So it's a car, a television, something like that. Look at the price increase for durable goods. Okay, that's where all the heavy inflation is, because those are the products that have the really intricate, complicated production chains. These are the products that have to cross the ocean multiple times, lots of different raw materials, expensive to transport. And so it's no wonder there's a way higher inflation in that category, right? So this is kind of a confirming piece of evidence for our supply chain theory, is kind of a way to think about this. Now, I like to put this in here because A, it illustrates what I'm talking about, that excess demand. And B, I just think most people aren't aware of how much money Americans spend. So this is monthly retail sales. So retail means discretionary, not mortgages, not paying off student loans, discretionary retail spending. Over the last year, Americans have been spending over $600 billion a month on discretionary retail spending. So you can see it rises as the economy grows, okay? This is all that savings that took place during the spring of 2020. Okay, so COVID hits, we cancel our vacations, we're not buying a car, we scale back our spending. So not only did we save a couple $100 billion, but we're also getting stimulus checks pouring in on top of that. So this is why America has such a big bankroll right now. Then we get let out of the house and we've got all this extra money and prices are rising anyway. So because this is not inflation adjusted, so we just start spending. So over $600 billion monthly just getting churned into the economy, and it's harder and harder to actually deliver product to the consumer. Okay, so this is that demand side of the equation. I'm going to briefly talk about housing under inflation, just because this is relevant, and it turns out kind of the same thing going on. Why are houses so expensive? There aren't enough houses, okay? That's supply and demand in action. This is, the way to think about this is just like per capita home construction. And I know it seems like there's construction everywhere, but if you compare it to the levels in the 70s and 80s, we're not building nearly as many houses as we used to. Okay, so housing cycles, right? We know it cycles, but we just kind of want to look at the overall pattern. So all of this construction here, this is starter homes for baby boomers, okay? So this is why it was affordable for baby boomers to buy their first house. Lots of construction going on, and then it starts to cycle over time. And then we have this very poorly timed financial crisis. Now, I know you can't choose when you get a financial crisis, because if you could choose, you would choose never. But this was very badly timed. We should have done this at a different time, okay? So, housing crash, it scares people off of building housing, and this is happening at a very bad moment for two reasons. Number one, This is when we should have been building lots of starter homes for millennials. And number two, this scared millennials off from going into construction. So we end up with a perennial shortage of tradesmen. So the way to think about this is it was a formulative event for millennials, seeing the housing market crater, seeing 25% unemployment in construction, okay? And it's no wonder we had a hard time convincing millennials to go into the trades. So right now, construction as an industry is much older than it was historically. There are not nearly enough young tradesmen, and it's very difficult to ramp up production because everywhere along the chain, building a home, concrete work, surveying, framing, HVAC, plumbing, electrical, roofing, there is a wait list, waiting times all the way through the process, okay? So right now, we really would like more houses, and it's very difficult to build at the pace we need to simply because there aren't enough skilled workers. And then, as with everything, you get to throw another fun little cherry on top, so then, you know, lumber and copper get super expensive, which doesn't help anybody. This is why housing is expensive. It was cycling down anyway. And then right here, we got scared off of all the building that we should have been doing. So as a result, the millennials are in the unpleasant situation of essentially competing with the baby boomers for the same housing pool, which is not what happened to the baby boomers. The baby boomers had a freshly built pool of housing for their starter homes, and we don't have that this time around. So it's no wonder the housing is really, really expensive. Okay, so let's move on to the labor portion. We'll talk about labor and demographics, and then we'll do some questions. So this is Idaho's labor market. This is total employment. Okay, that red line, that is 1 month. Okay, that's April of 2020. Now, it bears without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that that's unusual. Normally, when you have a recession, job losses tend to be strung out over at least a year to 18 months. Even a pretty severe, fast recession, job losses get strung out. This time around, 1 out of 10 people in Idaho loses their job in 1 month, okay? But because this is the state of Idaho, we decided we didn't like that. So we reopened, and Idaho became the fastest state to get all its jobs back. And we're currently #1 for post-COVID job growth, okay? So we've added 16,000 jobs on top of what we lost during COVID. But the rate of job growth has slowed down a lot recently. This is not because Idaho can't create jobs, it's because it can't fill them, okay? And from our perspective, a job isn't created until it's filled, right? We're tracking employed people, okay? Right now, okay, and I'll preface this by just saying, I don't encourage people to try to remember specific statistics from my talk because A, they change every month. Inflation will be a new number in 3 weeks. You're not gonna care what the March number was, right? We just kind of wanna understand trajectory, direction. If you are going to remember one number though, it should be this one. In the state of Idaho, we have 3 times as many open jobs as we have unemployed people. So that means if you get all the unemployed hired today, 2 out of 3 jobs cannot be filled. Okay. This is why job creation has slowed down. We can see something similar. Here's the Bonner County numbers. You get that big drop, instantaneous bounce hard off the bottom. You get all the jobs back by 2021. But then look, growth it's tapering. It can't sustain a strong trajectory upward. And that's because there aren't enough people to fill the jobs. So unemployment is very, very low in Idaho right now. And we have a very large number of unfilled job openings. So this begs the question, what is wrong with the labor supply? And unfortunately, there's a lot that's wrong with the labor supply. If it was just one thing, probably be easier to fix. So we'll go through a few of these, and then some of these I'm going to look at in a little more detail. Okay, skill level mismatch. This is our diplomatic way of saying that there's a certain strata of the population that's almost impossible to employ. Personality problems, sometimes it's mental health issues, but we just know that when you get down to like 3% unemployment, that 3% left over is really hard to employ on a stable basis. So right now, what we observe with our unemployment system is that unfortunately, most of the people that are unemployed, they're kind of repeat customers, or they're people that have had long-term unemployment. So they're not people who just got laid off and are trying to find a new job. They're people who are struggling over a long period of time to get hired and stay hired. Okay, so there's always that little 2 to 3% at the bottom that they're just not productive workers. And that's unfortunate, but it is the way it is, right? Secondly, we have very low population growth. Now, I know this sounds weird because growth in North Idaho, right? Well, it's mostly retirees. There's very little growth in the working age population, and this is tied to a long-term demographic issue. So the birth rate in the United States has been below the replacement rate for a couple decades. The only reason the population has grown nationally is foreign immigration. In many ways, it's uncomfortable to think because America loves the idea of self-sufficiency. Mexico has been our demographic backstop for quite a while, and we've relied on international immigration to sustain population growth. Okay. So we don't have organic growth. Now, this is a little startling to me. Northern Idaho, based on, because we had the new census come out, right? Northern Idaho was the fastest growing region in Idaho, and Idaho was the fastest growing state in the country. And yet, in all 5 of the Panhandle counties, there were more deaths than births. Okay, so in terms of natural growth is our term for the difference between deaths and births. Natural growth is negative. And yet, we had counties in the Panhandle growing at 3 to 4% per year solely on migration, on new residents moving in. The majority of these new residents were over the age of 55. So they're either retired or soon to retire. Our current projection for Bonner County is that the county should grow by a further 5,000 residents by the early 2030s. We believe 75% of this growth will be people over the age of 65. So it's very difficult to fill the jobs that need filling when that's your demographic profile. Now, people they don't think this way, but the baby boomers are a very unique social experiment. And what I mean by that is, before the baby boomers, we had never had a generation of retirees that was A, so large, B, so wealthy, and C, relatively healthy. Okay, past generations, when they retired, their spending dropped off dramatically. Okay, because before the baby boomers, you really didn't have an aggressive savings policy on a generational level. You didn't have a lot of households. Right? Before the baby boomers, most households were single income. Okay, so the baby boomers are the first generation to reach retirement and not really curtail their spending significantly. You know, on aggregate, the baby boomers have a lot of money. They have something like 60% of the disposable income in the country. Okay, so we've never had a generation that could still spend when they retired. They're also healthy relative to previous generations. Healthcare is better, and they didn't do as much manual labor. So they want to enjoy their retirement. And that's not good, right? We like these past generations that just kind of retired and kept a low economic profile. The baby boomers are prolific consumers. What does that do? It means you have a ratio of consumers to workers that gets more and more unfavorable with every baby boomer that retires, right? With the silent generation or the greatest generation, when they retired, you lose a worker, but for the most part, you also lose a consumer. Okay? With the baby boomers, that's not true. And so retirements are a particular issue right now. And I'll show you just how many retirements we've got going on. It's a mind-boggling number. We also have what I call disabilities of despair. Okay, this is a term that I use to describe 3 different conditions: drug addiction, alcohol abuse, and suicidality. Okay, so these 3 causes collectively are the biggest cause of death of under 65 males in the country. And they keep hundreds of thousands of people out of the workforce every year. Okay, so it's a human crisis, right? but it's also an economic problem because when our demographics aren't favorable, we need to maximize what we have. It's really hard to maximize what we have when we have a public health crisis pervading working age males. And it is almost exclusively males that suffer from these conditions. Right? And this is also linked to declining marriage rates, interestingly enough. You may have heard me talk about this before, but married men are less likely to be unemployed. They're less likely to commit a crime. They're less likely to have substance abuse issues, and they're less likely to die. Okay? The life expectancy for a married man is almost 5 years longer than for an unmarried man. Now, for women, there's no difference in life expectancy, but life might seem long. Yeah, so it's very interesting that marriage has positive effects. What we'll call proper social behavioral outcomes for men are tied to being married. For women, there's not a statistical correlation. So you could suggest, and I might be going out on a limb here, that the approval of women is in some cases a powerful motivating force for men. Who would have thought? Okay, so lower marriage rates are tied to this problem. So we basically have a kind of a subpopulation of, something like 1/2 to 3/4 unmarried, just kind of stagnant men who frequently have substance abuse issues. And it's very sad, both in terms of just like what they're doing with their lives, but we kind of need them to work, okay? Because our demographics aren't great, so we got to squeeze what we can out of the demographics that we have. On the flip side, women are missing from the labor force predominantly due to childcare shortages, okay? Just statistically, women are far more likely to stay home with children if there's not childcare available. And childcare availability is notoriously difficult to solve. And it makes sense when you think about it. There's two things going on there. Number one is the very fixed ratio of worker to child, okay? You can only have a certain number of children per childcare worker, and that changes based on the age. For infants, it's only 4 infants per worker. And I always thought, wow, that's really low. And now I have a 6-month-old at home, and I don't know how you can even do 4. So good luck to them. So you can't provide more childcare if you don't have workers. You just capped. It's an industry, you can't do anything to make yourself more productive, right? You can't streamline your procedures and take on more kids. You're capped by those legal ratios. And it's very hard to get childcare workers because people that want to work with children tend to go into public schools. The pay is so much better. And secondly, children start becoming a little more rational, right? So it's not hard to see why people that have a desire to work with children, they don't go for early daycare type settings. They want to work in the schools because they get paid way better. They get summers off. They're less likely to have fluids on them, right? It just makes sense, okay? So it's really hard to get workers. And as a result, you can't create more childcare. And then finally, we just have what I'm calling choosy job seekers. And this simply reflects the fact that there's so much money, so much liquidity, people's rents were deferred, they got stimulus checks, they got unemployment insurance expanded. For the first time in history, an unemployed person was not under financial pressure to take the first job they could get, okay? So that meant that some job seekers were able to slow walk their return to work or drop out entirely to go back to school, get a new certificate or a degree or something like that. Okay, so let's look at the demographic portion of this in a little more detail. This is the growth rate of the 25 to 55-year-old population. Okay, this is the baby boomers. Look at how nice that is, 2% plus per year. It's really easy for the economy to grow when you've got all this labor growing, okay? It trails off and it goes negative there. We're talking about 0.2% per year. We'll think about trying to get strong economic growth when your labor force grows at 0.25% per year. It's just not happening. You're going to have anemic numbers. Now, at this point, you might be asking, Sam, I have heard that the millennials are the largest generation in history. So if that's true, why didn't the population grow? The answer is there are only so many millennials because there were so many baby boomers. And the millennials are the children of the baby boomers, okay? this is why politics are so interesting right now, because everything going on in our country is the tension between child and parent extrapolated to a national scale, okay? That's why baby boomers and millennials don't get along, because every millennial sees every baby boomer as kind of their dad or mom, right? And vice versa, okay? So this is why you've heard the phrase like, okay, boomer, or whatever. It's not about boomers per se, it's about their dad, okay? That's the way to think about this. So we have a ton of baby boomers. The baby boomers grew up in households that had 4 kids on average, okay? So your average baby boomer had 3 siblings. They grew up to have 2 children of their own on average. So you get a lot of millennials on net, just because there are so many baby boomers, but that's not growth, that's replacement, okay? Every boomer family essentially replaced itself from a numerical perspective. 2 parents, 2 kids, so 1 for 1. That's what this looks like, okay? That's 2 boomers going out and 2 millennials coming in. So the average household size was essentially slashed in half over the life of the baby boomers. So it's not hard to see why you would get this cratering growth pattern. Now, the problem is that after this, we get into Gen Z. Gen Z has problems, okay? And I mean this kind of, it's kind of funny, but also their rates of mental illness are alarming. Okay, it's something like 45% of high school girls reporting eating disorder or body image issues, video game addiction. Gen Z has the highest suicide rate of any generation ever, okay? So Gen Z is not going to be some big economic boost. They're not going to be a productive generation if the health statistics are any indicator. The other problem is they're not driven to really power up for a good career, because most of them want to have internet careers. It's very sad. You survey kids in high school and the top occupations that they say they want are YouTube star, social media influencer, and video game streamer. That's 1, 2, 3, okay? Because these are their heroes. When I was a kid, we had real heroes. We had Joe Camel, okay? And now they just have YouTube personalities. As you can see, my dream didn't pan out because I'm not Joe Camel, but whatever. Okay, so we have a pretty bad demographic situation that we're facing. We were able to cope with this with foreign immigration. We also kind of avoided reality for a little bit, because for a brief period there, we were double dipping on millennials and baby boomers. The way that the timing worked out, you got 30 million millennials into the workforce before mass retirement started. So we had this little Goldilocks zone where we're double dipping on the generations, but this is no longer going to be feasible. So as the baby boomers retire, this is what I was talking about, that ratio of consumer to worker. So in 2000, 70% of adults in Idaho were employed. Now it's down to almost 62%. So the ratio is shifting, and not in a good way, towards consumers and away from workers. Okay. So this is why we have a labor shortage. This is why we have inflation. This is why we have problems physically doing the things we want to do. So this last decade was actually the slowest decade of population growth ever for the United States. Population officially grew at 7.4% between 2010 and 2020. Keep in mind, a decade is 10 years. So 10 years, 7.4% total, you're talking about less than 3% per year, okay? And when the baby boomers were coming in, you had over 2% per year. So it's the slowest decade of population growth ever. This is just because we created all those new states in the Midwest and gave farms away, right, to immigrants from Europe. So barring some sort of land grab in Canada, it's probably not going to repeat itself. Try it. I think we could take Canada, personally. I like Canadians, so that's good. Okay, so it's getting worse. See, I told you I didn't bring a ton of good news. The problem's getting worse because the population is tapering even more. This is the school-age population broken down by single years. Look at what we have here. There's more high schoolers than middle schoolers, more middle schoolers than elementary school kids. And once you get down here, it gets lower and lower every year. There's fewer births every year. So basically starting with the 18-year-olds and going down to infants, you're talking about 500,000 fewer as you go down the bracket. So the population is tapering more and more over time as birth rates fall lower and lower. This is partially just because millennials are much later to get married and buy homes. They're doing these things in smaller numbers. And it's not clear that there's an easy solution to this, because uniquely in the United States, income and number of children are negatively correlated. The top 20% of earners are more likely to have only one child than the bottom 20% of earners. And this seems to be because in higher income brackets, there seems to be this perception that you have one kid and you like hyper invest in that kid, essentially. This is how we get to these insane stories about competitive daycare admissions in San Francisco, right? Or putting kids on the list to be interviewed for preschool before they're born. I don't even know how you do an interview for preschool. These are not rational people. So, but they try it anyway. Okay, so it's not clear that there's a solution to this in terms of just like giving people money to have children. It's not clear that that's any kind of viable solution. The other thing to note is that the countries that have the most generous social safety nets, Sweden, Finland, Japan's of the world, they have lower birth rates than we do. Okay, so it's not clear that welfare state type solutions to this are a solution in any way. So let's look at Bonner County more specifically. This is Bonner County's population in 2020, this new census, and I chopped it up by 10-year age blocks. The bad thing to note here is the three largest age groups are the three oldest. The largest age group by far is that 60 to 69-year-old population. So let me slap up the one from 20 years ago. You can see it didn't look like that at all. The red is 20 years ago. Look at the growth that you had in those top two age groups. They essentially doubled. The 70 and older one more than doubled. So this is because in 2000, a lot of the baby boomers were in this age group. Okay, and then here are the millennials. We were still kids back then. Everything gets shifted up, but a lot of the millennials leave. Okay, so the way to think about this is, right, over 20 years, the red block should just move up 2 places, right? Because if you're 5 here, you're 25 here. But you can see like this block, it's nowhere close. You lose this whole group of people. So you lose 1,000 people out of this millennial cohort at the same time that you're getting a more than doubling of the older age groups. So when you look at this, you really don't need to question why there's a labor shortage. It makes perfect sense, because we have to remember that unlike in previous eras, those 60 to 69-year-olds and 70 and up, they've got money. They still can golf and ski, you know, so they're spending money. They're just not working. So we get a bad ratio of worker to consumer. So this is the total number of retirements. How many of you knew that we have almost 50 million people retired in this country? In the late 90s, that was about 12 million. So we're dealing with an unprecedented, I hate to call it a burden, because it's not like we're saying they're a burden, but in an economic sense, it's an economic drag. It's a dead weight on the economy because they're consuming a lot, but not working. So that all important ratio, that dependency ratio of worker to consumer is just getting worse and worse all the time. And this accelerated during COVID. So just based on age, we thought we'd have 47 million people retired by now. It's actually over 49 million. And this is just because a lot of people looked at what was going on, work from home, health and safety protocols. I don't want to deal with all this. My 401k is healthy. My house is worth a lot. I know. And so it's not hard to see why a lot of people just took a good look in March of 2020 and said, I'm not going to do this. So that's why you get right here. That's that huge jump of early retirements in mid-2020. Okay, so let's just kind of recap this, and then we have 10 minutes left on the allotted time, and I'd love to take questions. So inflation. Inflation might moderate as interest rates rise, but it's unlikely to return to normal anytime in the next couple of years, for the simple reason that the main driver are physical constraints that we cannot easily solve. We cannot easily get our hands on lots of neon, silicone, aluminum, gas, and on and on and on. We can't easily clear our ports. We can't easily get trucking working again. And the reason we can't get all that fixed quickly is because we don't have a reserve of labor. Okay? And you think, like World War II is the ultimate example. How on earth were we able to just suddenly start spitting out tens of thousands of tanks and planes and all the logistical components and ships? Well, because we had like 20% unemployment from the Great Depression. And at that time, our population was very young. You know, half the population was under 35 years of age. Okay, so you can solve problems more easily when you have a big reservoir of labor attack. We don't have that, so we can't solve our logistical issues right now very easily. Labor shortages are unfortunately likely to be chronic. This is simply the price we're paying for family size. Okay? It sounds so sterile and so boring. Family size is the main determinant of a country's economic path. Okay, because demographics are something that you can't steer with federal policy. There's nothing you can do tinkering with interest rates or federal budgets or infrastructure that can instantaneously whip up a big qualified labor force. Okay, so labor shortages are just going to be chronic as the price of our demographic choices. And so we need to shift our thinking and realize that we are now facing a world where there are physical limitations, limited availability of physical products, including potentially food, right? Fertilizer is going to get really expensive. Countries are going to start hoarding their own food because if there's food shortages globally, like my favorite example is Algeria, because whoever thinks about Algeria, but Algeria is a major exporter of citrus fruit. They don't really produce any cereal grains. They don't really produce wheat or rice or anything like that. Well, when there are global food shortages, what's Algeria going to do? They're going to rip up the orchards and plant wheat because they need to feed their people. What does that mean? In the developed world, there might not be citrus available in the winter. Right? We're used to getting pineapple in northern Idaho in the winter. That's because foreign countries export luxury foods essentially and import their grains. A lot of countries are going to start shifting to a policy where instead of growing things for export, they grow things to feed their population. So food availability will be limited. America, fortunately, is food secure. We grow enough calories to feed everybody in the country, okay? But we're not food secure in the diversity of foods that we're used to having access to at all times of the year, okay? So we need to be aware that we're moving towards this type of world. The globalized economy is fragmenting, and that means that access to all the things that we're used to easy access to is probably not going to be our reality in the future. So that's my rather dismal outlook. I apologize, but I swear never to lie to you. Okay? I might be wrong, but I won't lie. I'll be sincere in being wrong about things. So I would love to take questions about any of this. Yeah, inflation, any of it really.
Do you have any areas in any areas in the state or the United States that are doing better than Bonner County? Like what areas possibly have more people in the labor force?
Well, I mean, Bonner County, it's not really a fair comparison because Bonner County has a particular character. You're not trying to be some enormous manufacturing hub or something. So I'll just preface this by saying that economics can never tell you what to do because we're not making any value judgments. Economics is just about the efficiency and trade-off of different policies. It can't tell you whether that trade-off is worth it because we don't know what you're trying to do, what kind of community you want to have. Right now, the states that are doing the best with labor force are, no surprise, Texas. And we're kind of calling it the Atlantic Sun Belt. So think North Carolina down to Florida. Okay. Florida always skews more towards retirees. You get more of a young mix in the Carolinas and Georgia. People are moving to warm areas. I don't know what happened. People have kind of lost their tolerance for cold, it seems. Even in Russia, like the fastest growing city is Russia's equivalent of Florida. It's called Krasnodar down on the Black Sea. And it's like everybody's moving there. Even the Russians don't like cold anymore. So I don't know what that's all about. So the lower Atlantic Sun Belt is doing well. Texas is doing well. And then you have rapid population growth in the inner Mountain West. So Idaho down to Arizona, basically. Nevada and Utah in that little band. So the areas that are growing, you kind of think about a stripe on the Atlantic, a stripe down the Mountain West, and Texas. The rest of the country is shrinking, essentially. Illinois and New York lost population in the census, actually quite a bit of population. So, yeah.
So based on the inflation you see here, what would the average rate of like pay increase be just to keep employees even with inflation or not falling behind as far as their pay average outlay?
Inflation will probably creep a little higher this year, which means, and I know it's alarming, if you don't get 10% this year, you're probably falling behind in real terms. Now that's going to be different for everybody. For example, it makes a great deal if you have a fixed mortgage rate or if you're renting. Okay, because if you're renting, your rent is probably going to start escalating quickly year over year. If you've got a fixed mortgage rate, of course, that helps a lot, right? So it's going to be different for every person. But you're probably looking at something around, 10% is like not a quote me number, but we're probably going to be right at that double digit mark for inflation, give or take a little bit. Yes.
So with the open border that we have in the south, and the projected increases in the future, are you saying that those three, Atlantic, Sunbelt, Texas, and the mountains, are the only places where all these people are going?
So people coming over the southern border, the nature of immigration over the southern border has changed a lot. 20 years ago, it was predominantly young men from Mexico who were actually very likely to work when they got here. We really don't get much immigration from Mexico. They come from Mexico, but they're not Mexicans. They're from Central Asian countries, or Central American countries, Honduras and Guatemala. They're less likely to be employed. There's also, they don't see, the family structure seems to be different, right? So you have a lot more single men that are not tied to a family. It's just different, and the immigration that is coming in right now is much less productive than it used to be.
So are they going to the large cities then?
They are going to large cities in California and across the southern border. Actually, immigration from across the border is offsetting a lot of the people leaving California. There's this weird trade-off going on where you get affluent retirees leaving California and you get more foreign immigration into the cities in California. You always got to be careful talking about this because these are people, but they're not. It's just not the same as it used to be. It used to be very intentional economic immigration from Mexico. Often they had a family in Mexico that they sent money to. So it was just different. And Mexico really doesn't send many people here anymore. Because Mexico's economy has developed quite a bit. They've got more urbanization, so they've got more jobs to kind of try to keep their citizens there. So very little of the immigration to America now is Mexican citizens. Yeah.
So does the state have any projections over the next 10 years for the Ron County, considering we went up 20% in the last 10 years?
I do have a population projection through 2031. I'm trying to like visualize the spreadsheet. I think our population total was 52,000 for 2031 for the county. And I think it's at 47-ish right now. Yeah.
Was a
Generation X have any relevance in your models there? That was, is this a-
Yes, I always get a question about why I don't talk about Gen X. So two things about Gen X is there's just not that many. Gen X is relatively small. I feel bad for them. There was never a year where Gen X was the largest generation in the workforce. There was a direct transition from plurality boomer to plurality millennial. So Gen X has just always been outnumbered. And with the ages that Gen X is right now, they're not doing anything abnormal. They're not doing anything economically significant. They're just working. Boomers are retiring, that's important. Millennials are trying to start families and often failing, so that's important. Gen X, it's like you have to misbehave in some way, right, to get called out. Gen X just kind of goes to work, which is good, but it's not, you know, I should just put up a slide that's like, thank you, Gen X, for having like 86% labor participation rates and not causing problems. Like that would be my Gen X slide. Just kind of show up for work. So if you can coordinate some sort of rebellion, then I'll talk about it next year.
The expected, automation, especially like maybe trucking, that kind of thing. And that's like the number one job, especially for men in all
Yeah.
states. Can that be repurposed for the labor shortage, or it's too hard to learn where it's, missing? Like what's missing? Is it manufacturing? Like can the truck drivers move into that? Avoid?
Yeah, automated trucking would be massively helpful. We have shortage of labor in manufacturing, construction, mining and timber. So there's shortages of labor all across what we'll just call physical production. The problem with automation, what I generally say about automation is that it never quite lives up to the hype. And I'll give you two good examples. First, Elon Musk's new Gigafactory, right? Named it the Gigafactory because he's our richest nerd. We love him for it. He's a nerd. And he made this the most automated, efficient factory that America's smartest, most wealthy, prodigious, bizarre nerd could come up with. And it still employs thousands of people, right? So even showpiece automated manufacturing still relies on a big labor force. It tends to just make everything a lot more efficient, but you still need a big labor force. The other thing that makes me less optimistic about automation is the solution is Japan. Japan has a terrible demographic picture. Japan also has a very aggressive anti-immigration culture. It's very difficult to immigrate to Japan. It's just so insular. The etiquette and cultural forms are just so inaccessible. You have, this is actually true. There are people in Japan of Korean descent who have been there literally since before 1900, and passports will still say Korean on them, right? So Japan looked at this and Japan goes, well, we're not going to let people move here. So they adopted an industrial policy of robotics, specifically to try to solve their problem. This has been Japanese government policy for 25 years, is to try to offset everything with robotics, and Japan still has a bad labor shortage. Japan is also, more so than America, they're kind of accepting of robotics in social settings that Americans might find a little unsettling. I always try to be as diplomatic about this as possible. We know that Japan kind of has a robotics culture, I guess you would say. And so even with an industrial policy of robotics and a society that is just totally accepting of robotics, they still can't solve their labor shortages. So like part of me tends to say if Japan can't figure it out, America probably won't figure it out, not because they're smarter than us, but because that's just their culture. They're very accepting of robotics in interpersonal situations that I suspect Americans would find a little unsettling. So take that for what it's worth.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
So to lure people into applying for jobs with Bonner County, what do job seekers find the most alluring? Is it the wage? Is it the benefits? Is it childcare? Is it housing? Like, what are the most positive things that we should concentrate on?
by saying I'm not a human resources professional. But what I understand is that when we look at surveys, like what are you interested in? It's wage, benefits, flexible scheduling, and flexible telework possibilities. I know that, so I'm based down in Cooten County, and I have heard from some companies that they've had a little more success once they started offering the possibility of 4 10-hour days, right? A lot of people seem to like that. So flexible scheduling and maybe 2 or 3 days a week in the office, a couple days at home, that seems to sweeten it. And then, but the wage and benefits package is always, yeah. You ask people, why do you want this job? The answer is money can be used to purchase goods and services. That's from The Simpsons. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Very much.